Last video here, we're going to talk about some of the Cold War culture at home, and we're going to include the McCarthy era in this discussion. So don't underestimate how much fear can influence policy and can also influence the way in which people are living. At this point, there was a strong idea that the U.S. was a target of subversive influences. So what we're going to see is that there's going to be a major reordering of government power to sort of focus much more on national security. And of course, this has longstanding legacies till today because we still have many of these agencies in our federal government, many of which are actually stronger now. So the National Security Act, which was passed in 1947, establishes the Defense Department, and this eventually becomes a huge and powerful bureaucracy. And again, the idea is to make a priority to protect national security. We're also going to see other agencies get formed at this point that are pursuing more scientific research, particularly in the field of physics. And you can imagine why this happens. Again, there is this continued commitment towards researching more military technology in the wake of the arms race. Also, the CIA, which is created in 1947, at first sort of feeds off of the fear of communism. And so you are going to see that the CIA is going to be very active in trying to locate communist hotspots and try to prevent their influence from spreading. The CIA eventually, we'll talk about during Nixon's presidency, is going to have a major role in trying to stop a lot of Latin American countries from turning towards communism. So it's important to realize that it is established at this point. Truman also establishes what's called a loyalty program, and the point of that was to try to combat subversive influences towards the government and towards American society in general. And another thing that we have the National Security Act do is it really ensures that defense and military spending are going to remain a priority even in peacetime. So if you take a look at this graph down here, you can see that the precedent for U.S. military spending before the Second World War was that in times of peace, there was very little attention towards military spending. So there was a pretty deliberate demilitarization that would take place after a war. So in the years leading up to World War I, there's very little military spending at all. We see a little spike during the First World War, but again, demilitarization throughout the 1930s. And then check out this spike during the Second World War itself. There's a brief moment of demilitarization after the war, but again, ever since then, and this graph, certainly continues in this pattern, there's an increased attention to defense spending, which is a very, very new phenomenon after the Cold War. Another major thing that we see happening is that we are experiencing another Red Scare. Remember that there was a Red Scare after the First World War, but the second Red Scare is much larger. In a lot of ways, the Republicans are sort of fueling the second Red Scare. They put a lot of pressure on Truman to try to devote more attention towards investigating the backgrounds of government employees to make sure that they're not influenced by the Communist Party. So Truman was under a lot of pressure from Republicans, and he sets up an agency called the Loyalty Review Board, and the goal of that was to investigate the background of more than 3 million federal employees. And then also the Smith Act was passed in 1940, which made it illegal to advocate or teach the overthrow of government by force or to belong to an organization with this objective. So in a lot of ways, there were, some people that thought that the Smith Act was unconstitutional because it would have violated First Amendment rights, right, to freedom of expression and such. But this act is going to be tested by the Supreme Court in 1951, and it is upheld. Right, so this is really important because the Supreme Court is also taking more of a stance towards national security over civil liberties. In 1950, the McCarran Internal Security Act is passed, and what this does, it's similar to the Smith Act, but this one's passed after the war is over, and it makes it unlawful to advocate or support the establishment of a totalitarian government. It also, interestingly, authorizes the creation of detention camps for communist subversives, and Truman tried to veto it, but it passed over his veto. So you definitely get a sense of how strong the Republican Party is, in the sense that they have the 2/3 majority required to pass legislation over the president's veto. So by the time 1950 rolls around, we see that Truman is not very popular anymore. Also, the House Un-American Activities Committee is established, and what this does is it launches investigations into communist influences. It first targets most of its investigations in the Hollywood industry. It's important for us to know that the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was actually established before the war. It was established in 1939, and at first, HUAC's job was to try to seek out Nazis. But it's reactivated after the war is over, and the new goal is for it to seek out communists. What we see is that its investigations result in the blacklisting of many alleged communists. Blacklisting basically what it does is it puts your name on a list that prevents you from getting certain jobs. It very much sort of highlights the idea that you are anti-American, that you are a communist, right? Occasionally, people who were blacklisted would be put in prison. They were subject to many hearings. People who refused to testify would be tried in contempt of Congress. And sometimes witnesses would do things to try to clear their names. And so sometimes they would just, point their finger at other friends saying that they too were engaged in communist activities. And the purpose of that was, if you named somebody else, you were trying to get removed from a blacklist to be able to work again. But by blaming other people, basically this sort of fueled the blacklisting phenomenon, because HUAC had greater reason to believe that they should be doing these investigations. So basically what we see happening is that at first the targets are very much on the Hollywood community. You see here, this is a protest group that's saying, free the Hollywood 10. These were 10 major figures in the Hollywood industry that were accused of being communist, and you see certainly that people who are engaged in the Hollywood industry see that this is again a huge breach in civil liberties, and also many people make the argument that it's a witch hunt. Speaking of witch hunts, what we see is that as the HUAC activities expand, they're not just going to be looking at Hollywood figures now, they're also going to be investigating members of the government itself. So a major thing that happens here is that the former State Department advisor, Alger Hiss, is going to be accused of being a communist spy. What's interesting is the person who pursues these charges was none other than Richard Nixon. And Hiss ends up getting tried and convicted for perjury. And this really shocks the public, because at first, organizations like HUAC were just going after Hollywood. But when Alger Hiss went to jail, this really shocks the public, because they realized that even people in the highest level of governments could be accused of conspiring with communists. So the idea was that no one was truly safe, so to speak, from falling under communist influence. Also, the Rosenberg executions were very shocking to many people worldwide. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were U.S. citizens, but they were accused of helping conspire with the Soviets to reveal secrets about the A-bomb. They're tried, they're executed by electric chair, and even though, on the one side, people make the argument that it's for national security, civil rights activists are incredibly upset by this. They say that the only reason why the Rosenbergs were executed was because of the anti-communist hysteria that was taking place. And speaking of anti-communist hysteria, this is also the era of McCarthyism, which was where Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican, was making the claim that he had lists of communists that were working for the State Department. He had no evidence that these people actually were communists, but nonetheless, at this point, he sort of, in a way, took advantage of or rode the wave of the Red Scare to try to stir up more paranoia and make more people think that there was a heavy communist influence in the government. So McCarthy made the argument that there were certain people, oftentimes Eastern elites. He also blamed a lot of Democrats. He blamed Jews. He blamed African Americans. He blamed women's organizations. He blamed homosexuals. These were oftentimes the targets of his attacks. So again, the McCarthy hearings are also taking place right around the time of the 1952 election. So many people suspect that McCarthy was also trying to sort of sabotage the chances of Democrats gaining offices in 1952. And at least in terms of a presidential election, you could say that it worked, because Eisenhower, a Republican, is elected in 1952. Another thing that happens is that the media sort of feeds on the McCarthyism frenzy. And so a lot of historians make the argument that because the media was so focused on what McCarthy was saying, it made him seem more credible. So again, he's really taking advantage of this Red Scare mentality to gain a lot of following and to make a lot of people feel that what he was saying was credible. But McCarthyism is sort of a short-lived era. He eventually ends up sort of ruining his own reputation. First off, he starts to target higher and higher people in political office. So he starts to target members of the military, for example. He also goes on national TV at one point, and he appears very deranged. He makes wild charges of the communist infiltrations of the army. And also, he has problems with alcoholism. And what happens is that he gets censured, which means like basically silenced by the Senate. And this is a bipartisan effort to get him to stop. Both Republicans and Democrats realized that McCarthy was quite a threat. And so McCarthy becomes essentially silenced. The McCarthy era declines. And he dies just a couple of years later due to complications from alcoholism. So you probably know that Arthur Miller's The Crucible was based off of the McCarthy era hearings. I believe you read that book in English this year. But in any case, this is important because this shows us that many artists during the Cold War sort of felt like they could not freely express themselves anymore. So Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible about the Salem witchcraft trials in the 17th century, but in reality, he's likening this witchcraft hysteria to what's happening in the McCarthy era. If you remember from The Crucible, the young girls who were accusing all these people of witchcraft start to sort of point the finger at people who are in higher positions of society, which is exactly what McCarthy was doing. He started to actually blame people in the federal government, members of the military, and eventually these kind of accusations in the government end up crashing down upon him. Also, a lot of people who are writing, playwrights, even teachers, are required to take loyalty oaths at this point so that they can maintain their jobs. So this shows you that the government is very nervous about the possibility of communist infiltration among people who contribute to culture and also among teachers. The American Civil Liberties Union protests this. Again, they make the argument that the First Amendment protects people's freedom of expression. But again, the idea is that so many people were afraid that they would get accused by sort of conspiring with communists that most of them censor themselves. So that's why Arthur Miller writes about witchcraft instead of the McCarthy eras directly. In terms of Cold War culture continued, it's important for us to realize that after that brief period of inflation and workers' strikes, there's going to be a pretty considerable period of prosperity after the Second World War. Millions of Americans achieve middle-class status. We're going to see a dramatic increase in consumer demand, and a lot of this is because, as you remember, during the war itself, we had a lot of rationing for the war effort, and so many products that were unavailable during the war are now going to be open for purchase. And so many people are going to take advantage of this and increase spending. So consumerism will be on the rise. Also, in general, during the war itself, per capita income increases. And so by the 1950s, the average American was enjoying a higher standard of living. But it's important for us to realize that even though there is prosperity, this does not necessarily mean that people aren't very anxious about the potential of nuclear war, as well as economic depression. So we see, for example, there are a lot of movies and plays that are reflecting people's various Cold War anxieties and also their general fear of communism. Suburbanization becomes a new phenomenon. In other words, people are moving outside of the city and commuting in. This is supported by the fact that in the 1950s, so we haven't talked about Eisenhower yet, but in the 1950s, there's going to be an International Highway Act, Interstate Highway Act that's passed, which is going to build many, many highways that are going to be incredibly long. Interstate, of course, meaning that they span several states in length. Of course, for us, that means that I-95 is going to be constructed right along the eastern seaboard, and the proliferation of all these highways is going to make it easier for people to commute in and out of the city. And so many people are going to leave the city because they're scared that if there would be a nuclear attack on U.S. soil, that it would probably take place in a city, right? And so people leaving the city, even though a lot of times we think about it being idealized, you have a nice little backyard, you have your white picket fence, you have your dog. This is not just idealizing the suburban life. This is also getting away from the dangers that they associate with the city. You are also going to see that the government, in many ways, is going to try to encourage people to move outside of the city. Levittown is a really wonderful example of a mass-produced, low-priced, large neighborhood. This is in Long Island. Levittown had over 17,000 units that were built. They're very cheap. Many veterans take advantage of these types of housing projects and move to them. If you just do a little bit of research, you would be surprised to see how many suburban housing developments were constructed during the Cold War itself. I know I personally grew up in a house that was built in the 1950s, so this is very, very common. You're going to find that banks are going to try to make it easy for people to own these homes. They're going to provide low interest rates. Many of these are government insured, and they're also tax deductible. So basically the government is going to help people move away from the cities. Again, like I was saying, suburbanization makes Americans feel safer and more distant from Cold War fears. But we're going to see that this is not equal access, right? A lot of these new homes that are built are really only open to white consumers. So you're going to see that suburbanization leads to increased class and racial tensions, and neighborhoods are going to become more fragmented. A lot of times the moment a neighborhood starts to become mixed racially, you experience patterns of what's called white flight, where people who can afford to move out of the neighborhood will do so. And then you'll see that the people who remain in the neighborhood do not have the same sort of economic status. And so a lot of times that contributes to the deterioration of a neighborhood. What else? Baby boom. You are going to see also the birth rate is going to expand dramatically in the post-war period. You see here, this gives us a sense of the trend, right? The baby boom generation started right around the end of the war in 1946 or so, and it continues into the early 60s. So basically, you're going to see a dramatic increase in the population. This obviously is going to have significant repercussions once we get closer to the present day, because all these baby boomers now are reaching retirement age, and we're going to see that a lot of government programs to ensure that the retired are living comfortably are not really big enough to meet these needs. You're also going to experience some population shifts in terms of geography. After the war is over, a lot of wartime production cities are not really going to experience the same demand, right? So you're going to see some pretty significant deindustrialization in a lot of northeastern and also midwestern cities, which were sort of, they were like the industrial hubs of the wartime era. I always like to think of Bridgeport as a great example of this. Bridgeport was actually the busiest seaport on the East Coast until the end of World War II, and then a lot of its munitions factories were either closed down, some of them moved to cheaper places, and you start to see a lot of those jobs go away. And so what we see is a dramatic shift towards the towards the Sun Belt parts of the United States. So the Sun Belt basically comprises southern areas and also southwestern areas of the United States. The three biggest Sun Belt states are California, Texas, and Florida. What we see happening is that these states have warmer climates, so they're more appealing for people to move to. They also have lower taxes, and a lot of times military-industrial businesses are going to move to these states because they're cheaper for you to establish a business in. So what we see is that a lot of people are going to move to these places because that's where the jobs go. Also, you're going to see that there's going to be a shifting of tax dollars to these new regions, and this also contributes to the population shift. So basically what's going to happen is that this migration into the Sun Belt areas means that these old areas that used to be these industrial hubs are going to be referred to as the Rust Belt areas, right? So this means that basically areas like where we live in Connecticut are continuing to experience a decline in population, And this certainly continues to the present day. Most jobs are available, obviously with the exception of New York City, in Sunbelt areas, right? So another thing that we see is that the cities that develop in Sunbelt regions are going to develop slightly differently from the older cities, right? Highways are now going to accommodate the burgeoning population. And so we see a lot of outward growth rather than upward growth. So what I mean is, if you think about a city like Manhattan, this city obviously is limited in terms of its geographic scope. And so for the most part, it builds vertically, right? You build large scale, high-rise buildings and whatnot. This is Houston here, and even though you do have a pretty substantial downtown, just notice how much the city expands outward, and this is because there are extensive highway networks that make the city very accessible. So the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 is really going to help these cities develop outward. And another obviously really good example of a city that grows outward is Los Angeles. The GI Bill. Okay, what this does is it's going to provide access to education for veterans, right, as well as low housing costs. So the previous slide showed us Levittown, New York. Many veterans are going to take advantage of that. What the GI Bill effectively does is it's going to shift the focus more on preparing the incoming workforce to be much more educated, right? This also means that college is going to be much more affordable to anybody who does military service. So effectively what the GI Bill does is it sort of expands college education to much more of the middle class that might have previously just gone straight into the workforce. And even though the GI Bill was something that benefited men, this does actually in the long term also expand women's access to college, because since so many more people were applying to college with their GI Bill benefits, colleges were forced to grow. And so after the GI Bill period was over, colleges are so much larger that more women find themselves applying and attending college. And still to this day, statistically, more women enroll in colleges than men do. So this is a really significant impact on American education. And obviously, as we know now, college education is almost integral towards getting a real job. So basically, this is a phenomenon that starts with the GI Bill. All right, so last slide here, the 1952 election. Because of the Korean War, Truman is pretty unpopular, right? He was seen as being soft on communism. He fired MacArthur, so people don't really like him that much. And so Truman announces in 1952, which was pretty surprising, that he wasn't going to seek re-election. And so instead, the new Democratic candidate was Adlai Stevenson, who also is not really given a good reputation for taking a hard stance on communism. He didn't really have a concrete plan for how to deal with the spread of communism abroad. But the candidate on the Republican side, Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with his running mate, Richard Nixon, are going to take a much more tangible stance on what they want to do with the problem of communism. Eisenhower made the argument that he would end the conflict in Korea. And already, as we know, as of 1946, Republicans had regained control of both the House and Congress. Dwight Eisenhower ran, one could say, a somewhat simplistic campaign. I like Ike was sort of his campaign slogan. Also, Dwight Eisenhower had a military reputation. He led the D-Day invasion in Normandy, right? So he was seen as a logical candidate for president because of his military leadership. So as you can see here on this electoral map, he wins the election pretty easily, right? The only states that continue to vote Democrat are in the South. And this definitely shows us a little bit of a shift more towards conservatism in the 1950s with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Some people like to compare Dwight Eisenhower's election in 1952 to Warren Harding's election in 1920, right? The idea that people who were voting for Ike wanted to have a return to normalcy. Those people were generally opposed to Truman's Fair Deal program. And to a certain extent, you could make the argument that we are turning a little bit more towards the return to normalcy. So in the next chapter, we're going to talk a little bit more about 1950s culture, and you'll get a sense of what we mean by this return to normalcy. So that's the end of the last video on this chapter, on chapter 26. Thanks for watching, and I will see you